Hello, Year 10. So now we've finished the play, what we're going to do is a series of character lectures which will help you build up your flashcards, which need to be ready by the summer holidays for this text. So today we're going to be studying Mr. Birling, and we're going to be thinking about him as part of the older generation who do not learn from their experiences with the inspector. So we will learn some key vocabulary and quotations. We'll analyse those quotes, and then we'll talk about Priestley's intentions and how he uses Mr. Birling as a vehicle to express specific ideas. So let's start off though with a DNA. So define each one of these words, as they will really help you in explaining your ideas about Mr. Birling in an inspector calls. Pause here and play when you've got them all. So the outcome from today is to build up your knowledge and your flashcards, and it's all going to be built around this lecture. So these flashcards are going to be just about Mr. Birling. So you will need three kinds of flashcards. So for each section, I'm providing you with 3 points about Mr. Birling. So I have a section on Mr. Birling at the beginning and 3 points that we can make for him. So on that flashcard, you will want on one side Mr. Birling at the beginning, and on the back, what are the 3 main points? And you'll do that exactly the same for each part of the play that I go through. I'm also going to be giving you some key quotations and talking about the words that I would analyse and giving you some ideas. So for each quote that I talk about, do that on a separate flashcard with the analysis on the back. Now, if you want to add more analysis than that I say, then please feel free, but use the words that I say just as a baseline. And last of all, you will want a flashcard all about Priestley's intentions and Mr. Birling. I've got a couple of main points for you, and you'll just want those on the back. So let's get started. So at the beginning of the play, there are these opening stage directions which describe Mr. Birling. So the quote that is used is, Arthur Birling is a heavy-looking, rather portentous man in his middle 50s with fairly easy manners, but rather provincial in his speech. So this quote is really important, and we're going to start with it, but also end with it, and we're going to develop it with all the knowledge that we're going to learn. So our main idea is that it shows Mr. Birling is an arrogant capitalist and a social climber. Now remember, a capitalist is someone who only cares about money, themselves, and their profit margins. Now, how does that quote show this? So we have this adjective portentous, which shows that he's pompous. He thinks his opinions are overly important. It gives you that sense of overconfidence. We also have the adjective provincial, showing that he's trying too hard to be a higher class. Class means everything to him. But why? So Priestley uses Mr. Birling to challenge the stereotypes of capitalism, and he suggests that all capitalists are concerned about is maintaining their high status over others. So this is exactly right, but we can definitely add to this as we go through our lesson. So let's talk about Mr. Birling at the start of the play. So my biggest point here is that Priestley establishes him as a capitalist character. It's all about making money in his business, keeping labour costs low and profit margins as high as possible. He doesn't value community at all. He thinks it's nonsense, and he wants to look after himself and his family first. So the first quotation that really shows us this is lower costs and higher prices. So that's our first key quote. Now put the words in bold that we're going to talk about. So the adjective lower here, in terms of lower costs, that really represents the wages that he is paying his workers. He wants to exploit them so that he can make the money. The adjective higher demonstrates the money that he will make. Profit margin is all about your costs taken away from all the money, and you're left with that bit. So he wants most of the money to go to him, not the people who work for him, who actually really, really need it, as they're paid such minimal wages. He also prides himself on being a hard-headed businessman. Now, this adjective hard-headed is really interesting. He establishes himself right from the start that he won't change. He's hard-headed, he's got very fixed views, he just believes in business and nothing is going to change that. So actually, this foreshadows the fact that he won't be feeling guilty about what he's done in the play. He just will be unwilling to accept these new ideas. He's narrow-minded and nothing will change that. All he cares about is money. And then in his speech about capitalism, he tells Gerald and Eric a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own. So what I thought was interesting here is the pronoun. So I've highlighted his, himself, and his again. And all of that is showing his innate selfishness. He doesn't care about community. He doesn't care about the people that work for him. He only cares about himself and making sure that they have enough money to live on. That's all. So make sure that you can pause the video here. You can go back to certain sections. Make sure we have those quotes on 3 different cards. Now, we can also see Mr. Birling at the start as hubristic and dogmatic. So let's talk about our vocab there. So someone who is dogmatic is a person who has very fixed views, even though they're wrong. So we know that Mr. Birling believes in lots of things that are completely rubbish, because remember, the play is written in 1945, post-World War II, but set in 1912. So our 1945 audience can really see all the things that he's wrong about. We also have this word hubristic. Now, hopefully you might remember this, particularly from the poem Ozymandias, the word hubris, meaning someone who's full of excessive pride, someone who's quite arrogant. And I've also added in the vocab box at the top this great word intransigent. It's just somebody who is unwilling to change, and it's a great one that sums up Mr. Birling. So, all in all, he seems very foolish and very arrogant. So let's look at some of the things that he got horribly wrong about what was going to happen in the future. So when Eric asked him about war, he says, "What about war?" Mr. Birling's response is, "Fiddlesticks, the Germans don't want war." So I've highlighted the word fiddlesticks. It just shows that he thinks it's a ridiculous idea, it's nonsense, but it also shows that confidence that he believes he's correct about other people, about the future, and he's wrong. Secondly, refers to the Titanic. So he says this is unsinkable, absolutely unsinkable. And I think this is a really iconic quote. We have the repetition of unsinkable, again showing his confidence and using the dramatic irony. We know that the Titanic sank in 1912, the same year that the play is set. However, if you want to push a little bit beyond that, we've got some interesting interpretations. We could look at this as a metaphor. It could represent this sense of pride before a fall. So, for example, it could represent the capitalists. They think they are unsinkable. They cannot be touched by Labour. Nothing can hurt them. But he's absolutely wrong. Shortly after 1945, in the election, the Labour Party won with an absolute landslide victory against the Conservatives, despite them being so convinced that they would win on the back of 2 world wars where we were victorious. And finally, he tells Sheila and Gerald that in the future, especially in the 40s, they might be sitting down to a dinner with their child getting engaged, and he says there'll be peace and prosperity everywhere, except of course in Russia. So there's quite a lot of interesting ideas going on here. So the first idea is peace and prosperity. Those two ideas are completely wrong, because in the 1940s we had World War II. It was 1939 to 1945. It was not a time of peace and prosperity. It was actually a very low point for Britain. In the 1940s, there was Dunkirk, there was the Blitz. It really was quite a challenging time. But also we have this idea of except, of course, in Russia, which is completely wrong, because Russia actually became a world superpower as a result of the world wars. It grew in an awful lot of strength. It's a very powerful country even today. So ultimately, Priestley's ridiculing the capitalists. They think they're so right, but really they're not. And we should think that he's quite foolish. We shouldn't respect Mr. Birling. And finally, at the start of the play, I want to think about how he's ambitious. He really cares about his reputation. He's ultimately a social climber. He married above his status and he wants Sheila to do exactly the same. So if you remember those opening stage directions, Mrs. Birling is referred to as his social superior, which means that she is more powerful in terms of the class system. She was probably from a wealthier family. And he wants Sheila to do exactly the same. If you notice, he and Mrs. Birling are just Mr. and Mrs., whereas Gerald's parents are Lord and Lady Croft. They're on a different social strata, and he wants Sheila to marry up, mostly so that he can bring the two businesses together, as it will elevate his family status too. And he often name drops. He loves to drop in the people that he knows who seem powerful, and he's just desperate to impress, particularly Gerald. So here we have some quotes about the toast. So he toasts Gerald and Sheila because they are going to get married. However, he sees it more as a business transaction rather than being thrilled that she's fallen in love with somebody and they're going to be really happy. He says he looks forward to the day when Crofts and Birling are no longer competing but working together. So we have this juxtaposition between competing and working together. We might really imagine, due to the difference in status, that they're not truly competing. Actually, the Lord and Lady Croft have a far bigger business, and Mr. Birling wants to work together because that will make his business bigger as well. He will reap the profits of that. He quietly reveals to Gerald, though, about his social insecurities. We know that Gerald's parents have not attended the dinner party, and on some level, we get the sense that they disapprove that he's marrying Sheila, who's from a family that's not as wealthy as his. So Mr. Birling admits your mother, Lady Croft, feels you might have done better for yourself socially. So again, a really interesting revelation. We have this fragmented clause in the middle where he just says Lady Croft. And again, that's that recognition that they are from a higher status. But we also have this adverb socially at the end. And socially is really important. That is the most important thing. He just wants to climb up that social ladder to be as politically powerful and successful financially as he can. However, he does this by just dropping in that he is expecting to be named on the next honours list. He is expecting to be knighted. So he just says, oh, just a knighthood, of course. And the way that he says it, the tone, it almost sounds like he doesn't see it as particularly important. It's just a happy accident. But actually, we know that really he's incredibly proud. He's actually probably quite relieved to be climbing up that social ladder. So we have these words just and of course that make it seem unimportant, and it covers up how he truly feels. So all of this is from before, when the inspector arrives. So let's talk about when that fateful knock at the door comes. How does Mr. Birling change, and what ideas does he exhibit here? So in the middle of the play, we find out his crime. So he is accused by the inspector of sacking Eva Smith for leading a strike just because she wanted a reasonable pay rise. So Mr. Birling, though, is, remember, very, very capitalist. He's all about keeping those labour costs low so he can maximise his profit and get all the money himself. And she is part of his labour costs. Of course, he's not want to give her a rise, even though it's fair. So he says to the inspector, it's my duty to keep labour costs down. So that noun duty is really important. He feels like it's his job, but really, is it his duty? Should an employer not have a duty of care and fairness for their workers, which he is completely failing to meet? And again, labour costs is very depersonalised. He doesn't see the women that work for him as people. He just sees them as a cost. And he tells Eva Smith, go and work somewhere else. It's a free country. Now, these words are incredibly harsh. For people in the working class, it was difficult to find a job. They didn't have these options to go and work somewhere else. And it was only really a free country if you had the money for that flexibility, which these people do not have. So that imperative, go and work somewhere else, it's quite ironic. He knows she has no choice. He knows that she won't leave by her own volition, and yet he tells her to. It's very, very harsh. And he justifies this by saying she'd had a lot to say, far too much, so she had to go. So that clause in the middle, far too much, with the dashes around it, again, is interesting. She doesn't really have too much to say. She just is expressing her opinion. And remember, in 1912, women were not seen as equal to men, and perhaps he's expressing his patriarchal views here. She's a woman, she shouldn't be saying anything, she should just be grateful for a job. And he doesn't want to be questioned in his leadership, so it's far easier to just sack her. Now, he also tries really hard, but he ultimately fails to impress the inspector with his connections and with his power. It's an attempt to intimidate. He wants to seem untouchable, and Priestley's saying that's how all capitalists see themselves. They don't see themselves as people who can be attacked. So he tells the inspector, I was an alderman for years and Lord Mayor 2 years ago. So these two nouns are just boasting about the power that he has in his local community and this sense of right and wrong. And maybe gives us this idea that he thinks he should be a very respected person. So there's no need for a police inspector to be knocking on his door. And during his interrogation, he also starts to try and threaten him. He asks him, how do you get on with our chief constable, Colonel Roberts? So by dropping in Colonel Roberts, it implies that he is very close to him. Perhaps they're friends, which he later reveals they are. They play golf together. However, the inspector just isn't bothered. He doesn't care who he's connected to, what power he thinks he has. All he cares about is getting justice for everybody, building our community so that we can work together. And finally, Mr. Birling doesn't learn anything from this experience with the inspector in the middle of the play. He absolutely refuses to take any responsibility, feels totally justified in his actions because he thinks that the poor are greedy and the rich need to be careful. They've got to hold on to their money, otherwise these poor people will take it away, which is an extremely harsh worldview. So he says, when Eva Smith wanted more money, I refused, of course. And that little phrase, of course, is really interesting. That adverbial phrase shows that he thinks there's absolutely no other option. It's the only sensible thing to do. It's ridiculous that she should want more money. And of course, it isn't ridiculous. She is not being paid very much. She will be living in these dingy little back bedrooms that the inspector references. She's not being greedy. And he further justifies this to the inspector by saying, if you don't come down hard on these people, they'll soon be asking for the earth. And again, demonstrating he thinks that they're incredibly greedy and that he needs to make sure they don't step out of line. So I think the idea of coming down hard on them is making an example of Eva Smith. That's why he sacked her. He wanted to show all of the other women who worked in his factory, don't do this, otherwise you'll be in the same position as her. And again, we have this dehumanizing phrase, these people. He doesn't see them as individuals who have financial needs and emotions. He just sees them as the labour costs. And again, that pronoun they, they're different from him. It's very them and us. Now, the noun earth, again, is quite an interesting one. He thinks they'll want everything, but actually she's not asking for the earth, and that's the irony. She's just asking for a few more shillings. It's really not that much, especially in the grand scheme of Mr. Birling's huge amount of wealth. And finally, he really does justify himself by saying, the girl had been causing trouble in the works, I was quite justified, and ultimately shows he won't take responsibility and doesn't believe in social justice. The fact that he calls her a girl, this noun, again makes her seem like she can't be taken seriously. She's not as powerful. She's not a woman. She's a girl. It gives us this idea of childishness, but she's not. She is an adult. And that noun trouble also gives us this same impression. Don't cause trouble, otherwise you will be asked to leave. And he takes a very hard line, just like he did in that second quote. And finally, he says, I was quite justified. He absolutely believes that there was no other alternative. It's the only natural thing that he could have done was to fire her. And finally, in the middle of the play, Mr. Birling's tone changes. At the beginning, he stops showing off essentially, and he starts to become more angered and at some points maybe a little bit stressed by the inspector's unrelenting questions. So he aggressively tells him, I don't see that it's any concern of yours how I choose to run my business. So the juxtaposition between the pronoun yours and my show again that he doesn't see himself as on the same class level as the inspector, but also it's potentially making him sound a little bit defensive. He's trying to emphasize through the verb choose that he has choice because it is his. His money has given him choice. And again, we have this phrase, she had a lot to say, far too much, so she had to go. But I want to look at the fragmentation in the middle. So that clause in the centre, far too much, potentially shows that he is breaking down a bit in his interrogation. He's losing a little bit of that control. He's feeling overly defensive, like he has to justify himself. Maybe because he may be realising that the inspector is seeing what he did as wrong. And finally, he gets quite aggressive when he starts to bring Sheila into the interrogation. And he says, look here, Inspector, I consider this uncalled for and officious. So that first phrase, look here, Inspector, that imperative phrase, is really him trying to bring back control to him, but ultimately he can't because the inspector goes on to interrogate all of the family. And the fact that he says it's uncalled for and officious, those adjectives also suggest that Mr. Birling sees himself as completely untouchable. If we think back to that Titanic metaphor, that is here what we're seeing. He doesn't see that he should be attacked. He doesn't see himself as someone who would be open to being criticised. So as we get to the end of the play, it's really how Mr. Birling has responded. So he refuses to change his ways and he doesn't learn from his experience. But remember, that was foreshadowed at the beginning. He's in his 50s, so he's a little bit older. It's going to be more difficult for him to change. And all he cared about was that social climate and capitalism and money. Now, interestingly, he talks about the inspector as being prejudiced from the start, probably a socialist or some sort of crank. Now, this idea of him being prejudiced is almost laughable because actually it's not the inspector who is prejudiced. It is Mr. Birling who was prejudiced against Eva Smith. It is ridiculous to suggest that the inspector was prejudiced. It's just Mr. Birling trying to find a way to redeem himself, to justify himself. And again, calling him a socialist or a crank is very dismissive. It's a really degrading way of talking about somebody who believes in community rather than the individual. So when Gerald announces that Inspector Gould is not on the police force, Mr. Birling responds triumphantly, saying, there you are, proof positive, the whole story is just a lot of moonshine. Now, remember, you can't always analyse stage directions, and this word triumphantly is a great one. It almost gives you the sense that it has been like a competition that he's won. And I think the question is who has he won against? Has he won against just one girl who's very poor, who has no power in society, not only for her class, but also for her gender? It really does present Mr. Birling in a really negative light. And then by saying proof positive, there is no proof. All we know is that Inspector Gould isn't real, but it doesn't prove that Mr. Birling is innocent. Just the same as the concept of moonshine, so that noun conjures this idea of it being ridiculous, it's out of this world, it's just completely unrealistic, and he feels like he's literally got away with murder. And as Sheila and Eric don't feel okay about this, he tries to console them, just says, we've been had, that's all. And this idea of being had, it's quite euphemistic. So a euphemism is when we say something in a softer way that might otherwise be quite harsh. He thinks it's just been a joke, it's just been a bluff, but it hasn't. It's all happened. And by saying that's all, he's diminishing the real things that he did, the true social injustices that he allowed to happen. We see, though, at the end that he doesn't really care that much about the injustices that he created. His biggest fear is for his reputation, and he keeps talking about the scandal. So, if you remember at the start of the play, he said to Gerald, unless there'll be any sort of public scandal, that nothing will threaten my knighthood. And Gerald says, oh no, you seem like a very well behaved family. But now there is going to be a public scandal, he fears, and that's what he cares about. This adjective public is the biggest factor to him. He doesn't want other people to see him negatively. He doesn't want to be exposed as a villain or somebody who is money grabbing and selfish. He also is most worried because of the impact that that scandal will have on his knighthood, and he sounds quite wistful. I was almost certain for a knighthood on the next honours list. He's so disappointed. But actually, he shouldn't be disappointed about that. He should be deeply upset about what he caused, the chain of events that led to Eva Smith's death that he ultimately started. However, when the phone rings at the very end, he answers it and he hears that a police inspector is on his way over to ask some questions. And he looks in a panic-stricken fashion at the others. Now, that adjective panic-stricken is a total contrast to that bravado, that defiance that we saw earlier. And now he is frightened. He is frightened that the truth will come out and he will be shown to the public to be who he really is. And finally, Mr. Birling doesn't really care about people's feelings. He doesn't really care about Eric's feelings or Sheila's. He only cares about his business and his reputation. So instead of condemning Eric for getting a girl pregnant, using prostitutes, anything like that, or being supportive about what happened, instead, all he cares about is the money that Eric stole. So he tells him, until every penny of that money you stole is repaid, you'll work for nothing. So the noun penny suggests that he will really count the small things. He is looking through for those really minute bits of money because it all adds up. And that's all he cares about. He wants Eric to work for nothing. He needs him to earn it back because he will not lose the profit. He also tells Eric, some fathers I know would have kicked you out of the house anyhow by this time, so hold your tongue if you want to stay here. And again, we have this very much parent and child dynamic here. He doesn't treat Eric like a young man, which he is. He treats him like a boy. So the idea of kicking you out, again, is aggressive. He's not being supportive. Eric tells him earlier, you're not the kind of father a chap could go to if he's in trouble. And this demonstrates it perfectly. He shouldn't be trying to kick his son out. He should be offering his support. And again, saying, hold your tongue, that imperative phrase is used to a small child. Eric is not being given the support, but also the respect that he needs as an adult. And finally, Mr. Birling advises his children to go to bed then and don't stand there being hysterical. Now, this idea of them being hysterical is ridiculous because they're not being hysterical. Arguably, Priestley is saying they're being actually very reasonable. They're taking social responsibility. They've listened to what the inspector said and they've learned from their experience. And this just highlights the fact that Mr. Birling is intransigent. So remember that word, unwilling to change and narrow-minded, and the children aren't. And he can't cope with somebody else, particularly his own children, taking a different view from him because he thinks he must be right. So this brings us to Priestley's intentions. What was he trying to do? Was he trying to challenge, lambast, question, or ridicule? So ultimately, Mr. Birling is presented as a stereotypical capitalist. Priestley ridicules his dogmatic beliefs, remember that word, someone of fixed views, even if they're wrong, and foolishness. And he shows us that capitalists have this unrealistic worldview. So let's just remind ourselves of a few things that Mr. Birling was wrong about. So the Titanic did sink. He talked about silly little Labour agitations. They weren't silly, as in 1945, the Labour Party won the landslide victory over the Conservatives. The Germans did not apparently want war, yet there were two world wars, not one but two. We had accept, of course, Russia, which will always be behindhand, which is incorrect as it became an economic superpower. And he talks about that peace and prosperity, whereas actually we lived through an economic depression between 1912 and 1945. Now, Priestley wants us to see the audience as so wrong, and he encourages us to question whether someone like this ever had any control in the first place. Now, we need to remember it's a propagandist polemic. So a polemic is a story that focuses on a political viewpoint. And here, Priestley encourages the political move to Labour. He wants us to not vote Conservative after World War II, despite winning those two world wars, but as it did cause economic and social devastation. He thinks a more community-based approach would be more successful. And as we remember, Labour did win. And ultimately, Priestley presents Mr. Birling as the true villain to socialism. He exploits the most vulnerable in society for his own gain. And that's what Priestley is trying to show. He is trying to show and expose capitalists for being more selfish than the socialists. So that brings us to the first quote. We're going to talk about that again. So we have that part from the beginning. He was heavy-looking, portentous man in his middle 50s with fairly easy manners, but rather provincial in his speech. So we can now build up this to get to a 7+ interpretation. So this quote shows Mr. Birling's dogmatic. It foreshadows his intransigence when confronted with change. So again, I've looked at the same words, the adjective portentous. However, it means excessively serious, perhaps implying that he creates a facade of knowledge that he doesn't have. So do you remember that word facade from Jekyll and Hyde? It's that mask. Priestley may also be implying that capitalists have a narrow worldview, but they're desperate to be seen as more knowing than they are. And it's also ironic, as later Mr. Birling's proved totally incorrect about his knowledge of society through Priestley's use of dramatic irony. So I'm linking this all the way through the play. Then I've looked at the adjective provincial. It suggests that Mr. Birling's unsophisticated, as that's really what that word means. So he'll be unwilling to accept new ways of thinking. And he foreshadows the intransigence of the older generation, even when the inspector exposes their immoral behaviour. So why? And remember, this is where we can really start to build up our sophisticated interpretation. So Priestley uses Mr. Birling as a vehicle to challenge the stereotypes of capitalism and to discredit them. He exposes their lack of knowledge, and it serves as propagandist writing to initiate political change, as he implies we cannot trust capitalist governments to make effective judgments. Ultimately, Priestley foreshadows from the start that Mr. Birling is the villain of the play as the embodiment of the stubborn capitalist who refuses to change. Now that brings us to the end of our video all about Mr. Birling. Remember, you can come back to this if you want to do some revision, but make sure you've got those flashcards. You can go back through and you can pause at any time if you need a little bit more information or to add anything else. Well done, and now complete the quiz all about Mr. Birling.